March 2, 1945. Pacific Ocean. The carrier USS Enterprise moves under a grey morning sky. Light spray crosses the wooden flight deck. Sailors in khaki coveralls secure cables along the landing area. The sea is calm, with low swell and steady wind from the bow. A Grumman F-6F Hellcat approaches from the east, trailing smoke. The aircraft's right wingtip drips oil in thin black lines. Its landing gear appears half extended, the right wheel jammed at an angle. On the flight deck, yellow-shirted directors stand motionless, flags in hand. The pilot is Lieutenant Edward Butch the Hare, U.S. Navy. 29 years old. Combat veteran. Carrier-based fighter ace. His aircraft has taken shrapnel damage from a night interception mission over the Philippine Sea. Radio contact is intermittent. Only fragments reach the deck, hydraulic failure, manual drop, no flaps. The landing officer watches through binoculars. The plane's approach speed is higher than standard. Too fast for a deck landing, but the pilot cannot circle again. Fuel pressure drops below safe limit. The arresting crew readies emergency gear. At the stern, the crash barrier lifts, a woven steel mesh intended to catch a runaway plane. Wind passes through the open hangar bay doors. A crewman shouts coordinates. Range, 2 miles. Bearing 080. The flight deck officer nods once, signaling the LSO to bring him in. The carrier turns slightly into the wind. The deck tilts by less than a degree, just enough to align with the ship's movement. From above, the Hellcat's left wing dips. A hair corrects with minimal rudder. His radio crackles. Coming in hard, starboard drift. The approach is uneven. The right wheel remains locked. The fuselage vibrates from asymmetric drag. The landing signal officer waves the paddles horizontally, the standard command to wave off. But a hair continues. There is no second chance. At impact, the Hellcat's right wheel touches first, dragging the wingtip across the planking. Sparks trail from the metal skin. The tail hook strikes cable 3, slips, then catches cable 4, a marginal arrest. The aircraft swings 30 degrees to port, halting at the edge of the deck. Its right wing hangs over open sea. For 10 seconds, no one moves. Then, one deckhand runs forward with a chock and hammer. Others secure the tail with chains. The pilot cuts the engine. White smoke rolls from the exhaust. Lieutenant Commander William R. Kane, the Air Group Commander, later records in his log. A hair made an off-axis landing at roughly 12 degrees starboard offset to deck alignment. Hook engagement remained intact. Aircraft stopped within safety limits. Damage minor. Recovery successful. Those 12 degrees, written as a margin of error, will later draw attention from engineers. The photographic record from Enterprise's gun camera shows the Hellcat's alignment, not parallel to the ship's centerline, but offset. The wingtip clearance prevented total loss of aircraft and pilot. In the ready room below deck, mechanics document the landing geometry. One notes that the angled alignment allowed the plane to decelerate without hitting parked aircraft forward of the barrier. No one considers it revolutionary. It is merely recorded as an irregular landing. By noon, the Hellcat is hoisted below for inspection. The ship continues her patrol course toward the western Pacific. The damaged aircraft is logged as recovered by abnormal approach, operational value preserved. The event receives no headline. A hair's own after-action note is brief. Came in sideways. Better than ditching. Among flight deck officers, the remark is regarded as humor, typical of carrier pilots who survive mishaps. But the film footage, shot from the island's observation post, will be reviewed months later at Naval Air Test Center, Patuxent River. For now, it remains only an incident, one of many in a long Pacific campaign. A grey deck under wind. A fighter landing at the wrong angle. A near disaster that quietly ends in success. By April 1945, the film reel from USS Enterprise reaches the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland. The footage is unremarkable to most who view it, another carrier recovery under stress conditions. Yet among the engineers, a few details stand out. On frame 247, the Hellcat's shadow crosses the deck diagonally. On frame 251, the aircraft's fuselage lines up not with the carrier's centerline but toward the port catwalk. At frame 253, the tailhook strikes cable 4, perfectly aligned to the offset vector. The projectionist rewinds twice. Engineers in khaki shirts take notes, pausing to calculate the lateral angle of approach. 12 degrees. One officer marks it in the margin, accidental offset improved clearance, reduced overrun risk. At the time, American carriers still use straight decks. Aircraft landing directly astern aimed for a narrow corridor between parked planes and the island structure. A single mistake, a broken wire or misjudged flare, could destroy several aircraft or kill deck crew instantly. In 1944 alone, carrier landing accidents accounted for more than 40% of naval aviation losses unrelated to combat. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had long debated solutions: heavier arrestor gear, wider decks, or hydraulic barriers. None addressed the geometry of approach. A hair's incident provided an unexpected visual proof that a slight angle might deflect missed aircraft safely away from the deck center. The test officers at Patuxent River prepared scaled models. Using chalk deck outlines, they ran mock landings with miniature aircraft under a light fan simulating crosswind. The results repeated the same finding: an angled recovery zone permitted the plane to either catch the wire or, if missed, roll forward harmlessly off the port side. Commander Dennis Campbell of the Royal Navy visited the facility later that year. He had served aboard HMS Illustrious and shared the same concern: collision risks during simultaneous landing and deck parking. When shown the AHAIR film, Campbell requested a copy. His remark in the test log was brief. An accidental geometry, yet of sound logic. Worth development. Back at Patuxent, the engineers measured flight deck space using scaled carrier blueprints. A 9 to 13 degrees offset would allow full clearance for landing operations without altering elevator positions. It would also enable parked aircraft to remain forward, increasing sortie turnaround. The idea remained unofficial. The Navy classified it as experimental observation pending formal study. However, on a calm day in August 1945, a mock-up was constructed on a decommissioned training carrier anchored in the Chesapeake Bay. White paint marked a new landing stripe angled 12 degrees to port. Test pilot Commander J.P. Monroe conducted 6 landings using an F-6F trainer. The results were consistent. Arresting wire engagement improved stability. Missed approaches exited safely to the port side without deck collisions. Observers recorded the tests with 16 mm film. One note in the engineering summary read: offset configuration seems to reduce pilot workload. Visual approach more intuitive than central alignment. Yet official endorsement remained unlikely in wartime bureaucracy. The Pacific conflict was ending, and the Navy's priorities shifted toward demobilization. AHAIR's landing was archived, categorized under anomalous recovery, no further action. In the months following Japan's surrender, the test reels were boxed and stored in a Navy archive marked Carrier Approach Safety, 1945. Few recalled it afterward. But in Britain, Campbell's copy circulated quietly within the Royal Navy's experimental division. The footage, and a hair's deck angle, would resurface in an unexpected context, the reconstruction of post-war carriers damaged by years of service. For now, the idea slept within documentation, a practical observation waiting for context. The accidental 12-degree landing, nearly fatal on Enterprise, had already become a reference point for a safer world of carrier operations yet to come. By 1946, the Royal Navy had begun to rebuild its wartime carriers. The decks were worn, the aircraft faster, and the risks greater than ever. At Portsmouth Dockyard, a young officer named Commander Dennis Campbell circulated a quiet memorandum. The document, written in careful technical English, proposed an idea that sounded almost trivial: to paint the landing area at a slight angle. The title read, "Feasibility of Oblique Landing Area for Improved Safety and Efficiency." Inside were simple line sketches, an overhead view of a carrier with its landing stripe offset toward the port side. Campbell described it not as invention but as geometry. A 10-degree angle, he wrote, would allow a missed aircraft to veer safely away from parked planes, instead of crashing into them. He cited a single incident from U.S. Navy archives as supporting evidence, the 1945 film from USS Enterprise, showing Lieutenant Edward O'Hare's off-axis recovery. The frames were grainy but clear enough to measure. At 12 degrees, the Hellcat had come to rest diagonally across the deck, proof, Campbell argued, that an angled approach could work under real conditions. The mathematics were simple, but the implications were immense. The Admiralty reviewed the memo with indifference. Some officers dismissed it as unnecessary. Others doubted that pilots could adapt to a non-parallel alignment under the stress of landing. But Campbell persisted. He brought the idea to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, where technicians built small wooden models of carriers. In a wind tunnel, they simulated approach patterns and deck impacts. The results were consistent: an aircraft following an angled line either caught the arrestor wire cleanly or missed and rolled harmlessly past the deck edge. The data began to shift opinions. The concept was tested in full scale aboard HMS Triumph, then under maintenance at Portsmouth. A white line, 10 degrees off the ship's axis, was painted across her flight deck as an experiment. The test pilot chosen was Lieutenant Eric Winkle Brown, the most experienced naval aviator in Britain. On a calm day in August 1947, Brown approached in a Sea Vampire jet and touched down precisely along the new angled stripe. The wire caught, the plane decelerated smoothly, and the deck crew remained motionless, no collisions, no near misses. When Brown stepped from the cockpit, his report was short and factual. The new layout simplified his approach and provided better clearance. Subsequent landings repeated the result. Within weeks, the Royal Navy noted a measurable reduction in aborted landings and deck damage. A design once considered absurd had quietly proven itself through repetition and film evidence. Campbell's team compiled the numbers and photographs into a technical brief. The improvement was unmistakable: safer landings, faster recovery times, and the ability to park aircraft forward while others landed aft. The angled deck did not require new machinery or expensive redesigns, it only required a change in perspective. Across the Atlantic, American engineers studying British trials noticed the familiar geometry. In their reports, they recognized the similarity to O'Hare's documented landing. One U.S. officer wrote privately that the British had formalized an accident worth repeating. The correspondence between the two navies intensified as jet operations expanded. With heavier aircraft and shorter response times, the angled deck shifted from curiosity to necessity. By 1951, naval architects on both sides of the Atlantic had agreed on a standard, a 9-degree offset for all future carriers. When HMS Ark Royal sailed with her new flight deck, American observers noted that she could land and launch aircraft simultaneously, a feat once thought impossible. The idea's origin was never emphasized. In official histories, credit went to design committees and naval boards. The record of O'Hare's 1945 landing remained buried among technical films at Patuxent River. But within the unseen chain of cause and effect, that brief moment, one fighter drifting 12 degrees off course, had already changed the shape of every carrier deck that followed. The data proved the principle. The geometry became doctrine. And the accident became design. By the early 1950s, the world's carrier fleets looked unchanged from the war years: steel hulls, open decks, island superstructures. But on paper, everything was different. The deck itself had shifted. Naval architects now drew their lines slightly askew, the new angled landing area cutting diagonally across the flight deck like a quiet correction to a decades-old mistake. The change was so small it could be overlooked in photographs, yet it redefined how navies operated. On HMS Ark Royal, the first of Britain's rebuilt carriers to adopt the angled deck, trials with jet aircraft confirmed the transformation. The takeoff and landing cycles overlapped for the first time. Pilots no longer faced the danger of colliding with parked aircraft during recovery. Flight operations became continuous, rhythmic, and predictable. The margin for human error widened just enough to save hundreds of lives. The United States Navy adopted the modification soon after. USS Antietam became the first American carrier refitted with a 9-degree angled deck. Her trials in 1952 confirmed every British observation. Engineers from both nations met in classified conferences at Norfolk and Portsmouth, finalizing a universal geometry for all future carriers. The report spoke of deck optimization and recovery efficiency. None mentioned the incident that had first suggested the idea. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare's name appeared only in early test memos as a reference point for a film used in deck landing studies. He was already gone, shot down in combat near the Marshall Islands in late 1943. The footage of his damaged Hellcat, landing at a wrong angle on USS Enterprise, had outlived him. What began as an emergency act of instinct had become a standard of engineering. In training classrooms years later, instructors showed diagrams of the new carrier layout. Young pilots learned the approach pattern as if it had always been that way. Few questioned its origin. The angle was not commemorated, because it was not considered invention, it was simply practical, efficient, and safe. In naval aviation, such qualities rarely carried names. The angled deck spread through every navy that operated fixed-wing carriers: British, American, Australian, Canadian, and eventually even Soviet and French designs. It allowed larger, faster aircraft to land without endangering crews or equipment. It also symbolized a quiet maturity of post-war engineering, a transition from improvisation to precision, from courage to calculation. At Patuxent River, the original film reel labeled Carrier Approach Safety 1945 remained stored in a metal cabinet. Over time, its edges yellowed, the label faded. Technicians transferred the footage to microfilm, then to magnetic tape. In the catalogue, its description was brief: unusual recovery, USS Enterprise, F-6F Hellcat, Pacific Theater. No one noted that it contained the first accidental demonstration of the angled flight deck principle. By the 1960s, new supercarriers launched with angled decks built into their steel from the start. The design had become invisible through normalization. It was no longer a feature to be explained, it was the shape of safety itself. Engineers no longer spoke of the moment that had inspired it, only of the math that had confirmed it. History often remembers the loudest events, the battles, the victories, the failures. But in this case, the quiet correction of a single landing changed more than any headline could record. On that grey morning in 1945, a pilot lined up wrong, touched down at the wrong angle, and in doing so, landed on the future. The film ends there. The deck is still wet with spray. The plane rests at a slant, cables drawn tight, propeller silent. The ship continues forward, unknowing that the moment will never repeat, because it no longer needs to. By 1970, the angled deck was no longer regarded as a post-war innovation but as an unquestioned norm. Every carrier afloat, from Britain's Ark Royal to America's Enterprise and France's Clemenceau, bore the same diagonal stripe cutting across the deck. Generations of pilots learned to align with it automatically, their muscle memory shaped by geometry decided long before their birth. The manual spoke of procedures, never origins. In naval archives, the path of discovery had blurred. Reports were boxed, copied, and reassigned under new reference codes. The Royal Navy's files on her bleak landing trials, 1947–48, were preserved at Portsmouth, while the U.S. Navy's documentation on to-flight deck safety modifications rested quietly at Patuxent River. Between them lay a shared absence, no mention of the first incident that had revealed the principle by accident. The film labeled Carrier Approach Safety, 1945 remained sealed in storage, its metal reel rusting slightly at the edges. By then, naval archivists were transferring all celluloid to tape. One technician noted the film's poor condition and logged a restoration request. During inspection, the opening frames revealed a carrier deck shimmering under Pacific light and a fighter plane approaching too fast. The archivist paused the reel at the moment of touchdown. The aircraft was clearly visible, an F-6F Hellcat, marked with the insignia of Air Group 15. The plane came in 12 degrees off the center line. The tailhook caught the fourth wire. The frame froze on impact. Below, a faint note handwritten in 1945 read, "Lieutenant Eager hair recovery, abnormal angle, successful." The archivist did not recognize the name. In naval history, Aher was already famous for another reason, his solo defense of the carrier Lexington in 1942, an act that had made him America's first Navy ace and the first aviator awarded the Medal of Honor in the Pacific. The landing film, however, had never been connected to that reputation. It was viewed as a technical curiosity, not heroism. Decades later, when naval historians began compiling the lineage of the angled deck for museum exhibitions, the reel resurfaced again. A researcher tracing early correspondence between British and American design boards found repeated references to U.S. Film number 1460, the same identification used for the Aher footage. Cross-referencing revealed that the film had indeed originated aboard USS Enterprise in March 1945, the same day Aher returned damaged from a night mission. The realization closed the circle. The world's most fundamental carrier innovation had begun not in a lab, not in a boardroom, but in a moment of survival, one pilot refusing to abandon his aircraft, forced into geometry by necessity. When the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola began digitizing archival films in the 1990s, the restored footage was finally catalogued correctly under its proper title, Emergency Landing, Lieutenant Edward Aher, USS Enterprise, 1945. The sequence ran just under 30 seconds. To anyone watching without context, it looked routine, an old plane landing on an old ship. The significance could only be seen through hindsight, in the slight skew of the approach, the narrow margin between accident and invention. In later years, when modern carrier captains guided their ships through the same Pacific waters, the deck angles remained identical. 9 degrees to port, unchanged since Campbell's trials and Aher's misaligned landing. The steel remembered what men had forgotten. The film ends as it began, sea spray, smoke, the hum of machinery. No triumph, no ceremony. Only a line across a deck, drawn once by error, perfected by reason, and preserved by time. By the mid-1950s, the angled deck had moved beyond experiment into industrial design. Shipyards from Newport News to Belfast began cutting new carriers along diagonal flight lines, replacing the straight deck architecture that had defined naval aviation for 30 years. What began as a 12-degree mistake aboard USS Enterprise now dictated the physics of takeoff, landing, and storage on every seaborne airfield in the world. Jet propulsion accelerated the change. The early Sea Vampire and Panther jets demanded longer runways and sharper deceleration. Straight decks could no longer contain their momentum. The angled deck allowed both recovery and launch to coexist, a continuous cycle that mirrored the new tempo of post-war warfare. Flight operations no longer stopped for recovery, they rotated, 24 hours a day, in calm seas or typhoon swell. British engineers added steam catapults to match the new geometry. The launch rails were set parallel to the ship's axis, while landings followed the offset stripe. This arrangement, born from compromise, became the foundation of Cold War carrier tactics. A ship could now strike and recover simultaneously, its flight deck divided by function but unified by rhythm. On American carriers, the change was visual and symbolic. USS Forrestal, commissioned in 1955, was the first built from the keel up with an angled deck. To the untrained eye, her surface seemed simply larger. To pilots, it was a statement of trust. The deck no longer felt like a trap but a margin of control. The naval aviator's greatest risk had quietly been engineered away. Technical manuals from the era read like geometry textbooks. Angles, vectors, and stopping distances replaced wartime improvisation. The arresting cables were repositioned along the port side, calibrated for jet speeds approaching 120 knots. Hydraulic dampers absorbed the kinetic energy once measured only by guesswork. Every figure on the page reflected a century of flight evolution condensed into a few painted lines on steel. During NATO exercises in the late 1950s, carrier task forces demonstrated synchronized operations using angled decks. Photographs taken from reconnaissance aircraft showed multiple ships recovering aircraft simultaneously, their diagonal stripes like signatures across the ocean. In those images, national boundaries blurred. British, American, and French designs converged into one shared pattern, a universal geometry of efficiency. The Soviet Union adopted the concept in modified form during the 1960s. Even adversaries recognized its logic. The angle required no ideology to function, it was simple physics, proven by thousands of recoveries and millions of lives preserved. As aircraft evolved, from piston engines to supersonic interceptors, from steel to titanium, the deck remained constant. The same 9-degree sweep guided Phantoms, Tomcats, and Harriers. Catapults grew stronger, arresting cables thicker, but the angle never changed. Each landing traced an invisible lineage back to that Pacific morning in 1945. By the 1970s, no carrier designer questioned the feature's inclusion. It was drawn automatically, like the curve of a hull or the height of a mast. The angled deck had passed from innovation into assumption. What once required argument was now architectural instinct. In interviews decades later, retired engineers from the Royal Navy and US Navy would admit that the concept's origin was never formally credited. Some recalled seeing the O'Hare footage, others denied its existence. The record remained fragmented, as if the idea had emerged simultaneously across oceans, an inevitability rather than an invention. Yet the geometry endured. Every time a pilot lined up on approach, descending toward that diagonal stripe, they reenacted a decision made in desperation by a man who never lived to see its consequence. The technology of flight decks advanced, but the angle stayed the same. Steel changed, engines changed, nations changed, but the idea did not. It had been proven once, accidentally, perfectly, and forever. The Cold War turned the angled deck from an innovation into a symbol of reach. By 1960, the world's oceans had become airfields without borders. Wherever a supercarrier sailed, the faint white line slanting across its surface declared more than function, it signified continuity, the quiet geometry of power. The United States Navy expanded its fleet under the doctrine of mobile air superiority. Each new Forrestal-class ship carried the angled deck as standard. The offset runway allowed continuous sorties across the globe, reconnaissance, nuclear alert, interception drills. From the Mediterranean to the Sea of Japan, the pattern was identical. Pilots approaching at 9 degrees off the bow were not merely landing, they were repeating an alignment that represented precision, safety, and permanence. The Soviet Navy, observing from afar, began its own experiments. The carriers Kiev and Minsk adopted hybrid angled decks suited for VTOL aircraft. The angle remained smaller, the technology cruder, but the principle unchanged: separate the vector of landing from the vector of launch. Western intelligence analysts, reviewing satellite imagery, noted with quiet irony that even opposing navies had come to share the same mathematical solution. For carrier crews, the design altered daily life. The division of the deck created new rhythms, one side alive with catapult steam, the other with recovery lights. Operations continued through night and storm, guided by angled landing beams projected from the island mast. The approach lights shimmered across the waves like a corridor suspended above the sea. Naval engineers recorded new efficiencies. Sortie rates increased by more than half compared to wartime decks. Aircraft could be fueled and armed forward while others landed aft. The tempo of war planning shifted from the limits of hardware to the endurance of human crews. On every deck, the painted line dictated choreography, the tilt of machines, the movement of men, the pattern of noise and silence. At the strategic level, the angled deck changed diplomacy as much as it changed engineering. It allowed nations to project air power without fixed bases, to launch and recover jet aircraft thousands of miles from home. It made the aircraft carrier not just a ship but a moving border. In photographs from the Cuban Missile Crisis, the USS Enterprise appears again, this time larger, nuclear-powered, a diagonal deck bright under tropical light. The same name, the same ocean, the same purpose, but a different world. What began as a desperate improvisation had become an instrument of deterrence. British carriers sailed under similar principles. The Royal Navy's Eagle and Ark Royal operated alongside American task forces, their flight decks nearly indistinguishable from those of their allies. The shared angle unified procedures, training, and even language. NATO pilots, landing on foreign decks, found the geometry unchanged. The sea, once divided by flags, now carried a single standard line of approach. In the decades that followed, the angled deck became the invisible grammar of naval power. It allowed strategy to function at jet speed. It enabled diplomacy conducted through presence alone. A carrier at anchor no longer symbolized rest, it represented readiness. For all its significance, the innovation's birth remained obscure. No ceremony, no monument, no name engraved in steel. Only a shape, repeated across oceans. The line that began with a misaligned landing continued through the atomic age, its purpose never altered, its origin seldom remembered. The Cold War produced louder machines, faster aircraft, heavier weapons. Yet beneath every thunderous launch and screaming recovery lay the same quiet angle, a trace of one pilot's instinct, drawn into permanence by engineers who saw what he had done. In the geometry of power, the smallest deviation had become the most enduring. Every carrier deck carries the memory of its pilots. Beneath the roar of turbines and the rhythm of arresting cables, the angled landing area shaped how aviators thought about survival. Before its arrival, landing on a carrier had been a calculated gamble, a perfect combination of speed, alignment, and luck. Pilots spoke of the corridor of fear, a narrow line between safety and destruction. After the angle, the fear changed shape. The deck was still dangerous, but it offered structure. Approach lights guided pilots down a corridor defined not by risk, but by geometry. Instructors taught the procedure as instinct: align with the stripe, adjust throttle, keep the ball centered. The deck that once demanded courage now demanded precision. Night landings remained tense, but the pattern became measurable. Each pilot trusted that a missed arrestor wire would lead not to collision, but to escape, a safe bolter, a chance to try again. The angled deck gave permission to fail without dying. It turned chance into process. Flight deck crews noticed the difference first. In the old straight deck days, their eyes never left the landing aircraft, ready to dive clear of metal and fire. After the angled deck, they worked closer to the landing zone, confident that a bolter would pass safely to port. The line between terror and trust narrowed until it was no longer spoken about, only felt in the rhythm of their movements. Psychologists studying carrier operations in the 1960s described the deck as a machine of precision that reshaped human behavior. Every landing was a ritual of measurement. The new system demanded calm instead of nerve. Pilots became technicians of approach angles, their instincts trained by instruments and light cues. The myth of bravery gave way to the science of control. Training films from this period show young aviators seated in simulators, eyes fixed on moving horizon lines projected before them. Instructors emphasize glide slope, speed, and correction angles, never luck. They are teaching the mathematics of safety disguised as routine. Every trainee learns to think in degrees, not distance. The perfect landing is no longer a performance but a calculation. On deck, the change echoed in language. The word crashed faded from vocabulary, replaced by recovery. The accident board became the safety committee. Even the term landing signal officer evolved, less about guiding by instinct, more about interpreting data. The angle had turned flight from art into engineering, and with it, men into instruments of reliability. Still, the risk remained. Deck operations continued to claim lives. But in interviews, veteran pilots spoke of a subtle transformation. They no longer feared the deck itself. The motion, the noise, the heat, all familiar, all controlled. What frightened their predecessors had become procedural. Lieutenant Commander John Kane, one of the Navy's early jet pilots, once told an interview, "The angle made us feel the ship was helping." His remark described not comfort, but cooperation, the sense that the machine had finally been designed with human survival in mind. The deck slant, invisible to those walking across it, altered more than operations. It redefined trust between pilot and ship. It created a generation of aviators who believed precision could overcome chaos. And it proved, once again, that the smallest detail, a shift of a few degrees, could change human behavior as profoundly as it changed machinery. On nights when the sea was calm and the stars reflected in the oil-slick surface, pilots on approach could see the landing lights stretch diagonally across the black water. In that faint illuminated line, geometry became sanctuary. Every landing was a quiet conversation between man, machine, and memory. The angle was no longer an accident. It had become instinct. By the late 1970s, naval engineers and pilots around the world had inherited the angled deck as something ancient, so familiar that its birth seemed irrelevant. The men who had fought to prove it were retiring. The documents that had described its development yellowed in filing cabinets, retyped only when required for training manuals. In every reference, the feature appeared as established fact. No citation. No inventor. Just design. In the United States, the Bureau of Aeronautics archives at Patuxent River underwent digitization. Decades of film reels were catalogued by interns who did not know the stories behind the numbers. One of them, reviewing reeled carrier approach safety, 1945, noticed a brief annotation on the edge of the leader tape, Lieutenant E. Hare, USS Enterprise. It was a name recognized from textbooks and museums, the first American naval ace of World War II. Yet the image that followed bore no trace of heroism. On screen, the plane drifts sideways across the deck. There is no music, no announcement, only the mechanical rhythm of film. The Hellcat touches down, tail hook strikes, smoke trails, and the machine stops short of the island tower. The pilot's head turns slightly toward the camera, then the reel ends. 30 seconds. A routine recovery, preserved without commentary. The archivist included it in a compilation of unusual carrier operations. Weeks later, a British researcher working on the history of the angled deck noticed the same footage in the US Navy database. He requested a copy, comparing it against stills from Royal Navy trials. The alignment matched perfectly, the same 12-degree offset that Campbell's engineers had measured during the first HMS Triumph tests. Cross-referencing memos revealed that the American footage had been sent to Britain in 1946 under the heading Carrier Recovery Safety Footage, Case Study. The shipment note bore Campbell's initials in pencil. For the first time in 3 decades, the chain of evidence was visible. The conclusion was simple, yet astonishing: the angled deck, the defining feature of all modern carriers, had originated not from deliberate invention but from a moment of emergency. Edward Hare, returning from combat with a damaged aircraft, had landed at the wrong angle, and in doing so, revealed a safer geometry. There was no record that Hare himself ever knew what followed. He was killed in action in November 1943, more than a year before his misaligned landing became the subject of study. His name, attached to a single film reel, was quietly detached as the idea matured into design doctrine. The Navy credited committees, departments, and test centers, but never the man whose instinct had produced the first proof. When the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola later screened the recovered footage for curators, they added a short note to the description, believed to have inspired angled deck concept adopted post-war. No ceremony accompanied the reclassification. It was treated as a clerical correction, not a revelation. The myth of invention rarely allows for accidents. Yet in this case, history's most influential carrier innovation came from one. A damaged aircraft, a forced decision, and a landing that should have failed. In the quiet of an archive room, under flickering fluorescent light, the film plays endlessly on repeat. The same 12-degree drift, the same catch of cable 4, the same pause before the deck crew runs forward. Each viewing erases a little more distance between error and design, between instinct and engineering. The past does not shout in triumph. It whispers through geometry, through the faint slant of a deck still drawn at the same angle today. Hare's legacy is not a memorial in stone, but a line in steel, tilted slightly, permanently, towards safety. Modern carriers no longer resemble the wooden flight decks of the Pacific War. They are floating cities, nuclear-powered, built from 100,000 tons of steel. Yet their flight paths still follow the same invisible geometry traced by a wounded Hellcat over the Philippine Sea. The angled deck remains unchanged, its purpose unchanged, its origin mostly forgotten. From the bridge of a ship like the USS Gerald R. Ford, the deck appears as pure order, long lines of arresting cables, precision lighting systems, and digital landing aids calculating degrees of deviation in real time. But beneath every measurement lies an inheritance written long before electronics existed. The offset that saves pilots from collision, the clearance that gives them room to fail, all return to that first instinctive correction by a man flying half-blind through smoke and wind. Carrier aviation became the most disciplined form of flight on Earth. Thousands of landings occur each year without ceremony, each a mathematical repetition of Hare's unplanned descent. Pilots do not see it as legacy, they see it as procedure. Geometry replaced memory. Naval historians often describe technological progress as deliberate, drafted in laboratories, refined by committees, approved by design boards. But real innovation often begins in chaos, in the unrecorded seconds between survival and loss. The angled deck was never drawn to be beautiful, or even original. It was drawn because a pilot once landed sideways and survived. In the long chain of cause and effect, the accident became method, the method became doctrine, and the doctrine became the shape of safety. The world's greatest war machine adopted a principle born not from command, but from instinct. At museums and air shows, retired aviators sometimes tell younger visitors that every line on a carrier deck has a reason. Few mention that one of those lines, the most important, began as an error. Fewer still know the name of the man whose landing showed that error could save lives. A Hare Field in Chicago carries his name now, a memorial of valor in air combat. Yet in another way, his memory extends silently across every sea, through the steel decks of ships that never met him. Each time a jet arcs downward toward a carrier's angled stripe, guided by its lights and instruments, it traces the same path he once flew without choice or certainty. The footage of his landing remains grainy and brief. There are no close-ups, no voices, only the raw mechanical truth of film, motion, friction, and impact. In that image, time folds inward. One man's emergency becomes a blueprint for generations. The angled deck endures not because it was invented, but because it works. That is its quiet perfection. It belongs to no nation, no engineer, no theory. It belongs to the moment when survival revealed design. If the sea has memory, it holds that image still, a carrier rolling through grey swells, a single aircraft descending at the wrong angle, and a handful of men bracing for disaster that never came. The hook catches, the plane stops, and for a few seconds, the deck is silent. In that silence, naval aviation found its future. The ship continues forward. The wake spreads wide. The line across the deck glows faintly in the sun, permanent, exact, unremarked. What began as a mistake has become the world's most reliable angle, a testament to precision born of chance, and to a pilot whose final descent drew safety into the very structure of flight.